Europe had fallen faster than anyone in Britain believed possible. In just 6 weeks, Hitler's armies swept through the Low Countries like a tide breaking through sandcastles. The Maginot Line, once thought unbreachable, was simply bypassed. The Ardennes, which Allied commanders considered impassable for tanks, became the very root of their destruction. By May 10, 1940, the German Blitzkrieg ignited across the continent. Belgium collapsed in days, the Dutch surrendered within a week, and by May 20th, the spearhead of General Heinz Guderian's Panzer divisions had reached the English Channel at Abbeville, slicing the Allied armies in two. The British Expeditionary Force, more than 338,000 men, was trapped in northern France, along with remnants of French and Belgian forces. Their only escape route was a thin strip of coastline between Dunkirk and the sea. London's generals still believed they could turn the tide. Orders came to regroup, to hold firm, to fall back in order. But order was already an illusion. Columns of soldiers marched through burning villages, refugees flooding the same roads in the opposite direction. Supply lines were shattered. Ammunition ran thin. Communication between units failed. The plan was to withdraw by rail, through Calais and Dunkirk. Dozens of military trains had been promised to evacuate troops to the ports before the Germans arrived. Yet as days passed, the tracks fell silent. Bombed bridges, derailed carriages, and shattered rail stations left thousands stranded. At Arras, soldiers waited for trains that never came. At Lille, entire battalions stood beside twisted rails, staring at the horizon, listening for the faint whistle of salvation. It never sounded. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. The Germans were closing in from every direction, tanks from the south, aircraft from above, and artillery from the east. The evacuation by train had failed before it began. Now, the only route left was the sea. The British command launched Operation Dynamo, an improvised plan conceived in desperation on May 26, 1940, in the underground tunnels beneath Dover Castle. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay was given one impossible order: bring the army home. But across the channel on the beaches of Dunkirk, there were no docks. The port had been bombed beyond use. The waters were too shallow for large warships to reach the shore. Thousands of soldiers stood ankle-deep in the tide, waiting under relentless air attacks. Every minute, the Luftwaffe dived. Every hour, the sand turned darker. And still, they waited for a train that would never arrive, for a ship that had not yet come. Yet amid the chaos, something unthinkable began to happen. The British Admiralty issued a call to all civilian vessels, fishing boats, pleasure yachts, ferries, even lifeboats. They would cross the channel through minefields and bombs to rescue an army. No one knew if it would work. No one believed it could, but there was no alternative. The miracle of Dunkirk, as history would later call it, was not yet a miracle. It was a disaster unfolding, one that depended not on generals or machines, but on courage and chance. And it had begun with a single failure: the train that never came. The soldiers stranded in northern France would soon learn that their only path home was through the sea. But even that path would be swallowed by fire and storm before it could open. By the end of May 27, 1940, the situation in France had deteriorated beyond recognition. German armor had encircled the northern pocket, closing the jaws around Dunkirk. From the west, General Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps held the coast near Calais. From the south, General Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division cut through the French defenses like a blade. And from the east, General von Kleist's tanks rolled toward the beaches, tightening the noose. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, commanded by General Lord Gort, now stood cornered. Around 400,000 Allied troops were trapped in a shrinking pocket, no more than 60 miles wide and 15 miles deep. Behind them lay the sea. Before them, the Wehrmacht. The Germans had achieved what military planners called a classic encirclement. The Allied armies, once proud veterans of the Great War, had been reduced to fugitives on their own battlefield. Their vehicles ran dry of fuel. Their artillery shells were nearly gone. The skies belonged to the Luftwaffe. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill faced an unthinkable choice: negotiate peace or fight for survival. But Churchill refused to surrender. Instead, he sent a simple, chilling order to the trapped army: Evacuate as many as possible. Every man you save is a victory. The word evacuate spread across the beaches like a rumor. Officers stared at their radios in disbelief. Soldiers looked toward the horizon and saw nothing but smoke. The port of Dunkirk was already in ruins. German bombers had targeted it relentlessly for days, setting oil tanks ablaze, destroying cranes, piers, and ships. The rail lines leading to the port, once meant for orderly evacuation, were mangled iron skeletons. The train that never came had been reduced to a memory, a cruel joke among the men still waiting in the mud. At this stage, Operation Dynamo was less a plan and more an act of faith. Admiral Ramsay's headquarters beneath Dover Castle was alive with chaos, signals crackling, maps covered in red arrows, lists of available vessels being updated by the hour. Only a handful of destroyers and transport ships were immediately ready. Then came the unexpected lifeline: civilian boats. Fishing trawlers, paddle steamers, motor yachts, barges, and ferries, hundreds of them, began to answer the Admiralty's desperate call. Some were crewed by naval reservists, others by ordinary citizens who had never seen combat. Across southern England, small ports like Ramsgate, Margate, and Deal became gateways to history. Men packed supplies, filled tanks, and set out into the night, steering toward the glow of burning Dunkirk on the horizon. The Germans, meanwhile, stood poised to deliver the final blow. On May 24th, Hitler had issued one of the most debated orders of the war, the infamous Halt Order. His armored divisions, only 15 miles from Dunkirk, were told to stop advancing. Hitler, advised by Field Marshal von Rundstedt, feared his tanks might become bogged down in the marshy terrain. He believed the Luftwaffe could finish the job from the air. It was a mistake that would cost him the war. Those 2 days of hesitation, May 24th and 25, gave the Allies a window, a sliver of time to prepare the evacuation. The beaches became staging grounds. Men organized into lines, trenches, and makeshift perimeters. Royal Engineers built temporary piers out of trucks and debris, allowing smaller boats to ferry men to deeper waters. Still, chaos ruled. Communication broke down. Some men waded into the surf under strafing aircraft, clutching helmets above their heads. Others huddled in sand dunes, praying for a miracle. For every hour they survived, another chance to escape appeared. And so, from that narrow edge of France, where trains had failed, where the roads were gone, and the sky was death, the greatest sea evacuation in history began. But for every ship that reached the shore, another burned. For every man rescued, another drowned. The beaches of Dunkirk were becoming both a graveyard and a lifeline. They called it the miracle of Dunkirk. But for the men who lived it, it was no miracle. It was endurance on the beaches. The British Expeditionary Force stood in silent ranks, waiting for rescue under skies alive with fire. There was no cover, no shade, no promise of survival. The sand was littered with burned vehicles, shattered helmets, and the blackened remains of trucks turned into makeshift barricades. Rations ran out. Water turned brackish. The wounded were carried to the shore and laid in rows, waiting for boats that might never come. And yet there was order, a discipline that defied terror. Men shared their last biscuits, passed canteens from hand to hand, and stood firm even as German bombers screamed overhead. When Stuka dive bombers attacked, soldiers did not scatter. They dropped flat in synchronized waves, the sound of their helmets clanging against the sand like a grim orchestra. When the bombs fell, they rose again, brushed off the grit, and moved back into line. Officers knew that panic meant death. Calm meant survival. There were no speeches, no music, no heroic charges. Only the quiet, unspoken understanding that the fate of Britain rested on their endurance. In those endless days and nights, the men on Dunkirk's beaches learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was standing still when every instinct screamed to run. And as they stared out across the gray sea, they saw shapes emerging in the distance, not battleships, not destroyers, but small, humble boats coming for them. The human spirit had met its breaking point and refused to break. From a military perspective, Dunkirk should have been impossible. The coastline offered no natural harbor. The tides were treacherous and the sand too shallow for warships to approach. Yet British engineers and officers transformed this deadly trap into a functioning evacuation zone under enemy fire. Every hour mattered. Every decision carried the weight of thousands of lives. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force fought a silent war above the beaches. Although soldiers below often cursed the absent RAF, the truth was that British pilots were fighting ferociously, intercepting Luftwaffe bombers before they reached Dunkirk. In just 9 days, they flew over 3,500 sorties, sacrificing many to keep the skies contested. The entire operation became a living organism. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and civilians all functioning as one. Dunkirk had no infrastructure, no logistics, no plan that could be rehearsed, only willpower and coordination under pressure. By June 1st, the impassable port was running like a living artery, ships arriving, loading, departing, feeding the lifeline of Britain's survival. For the engineers, Dunkirk was a battle against nature itself. The tides on the French coast rose and fell unpredictably, dragging wrecks and mines into new positions every day. The shallow beaches meant that large vessels risked grounding before reaching the shore, while smaller boats risked capsizing in the waves. To make the evacuation possible, British naval engineers began charting the seabed, marking safe channels with improvised buoys made from oil drums and debris. They repaired ships mid-sea using whatever materials they had: rope, tar, wood, even parts scavenged from sinking vessels. When destroyers took bomb damage, crews patched holes with mattresses and life vests. When ferry boats lost steering, engineers tied them to other vessels with cables, steering by tandem. The sea was alive with hazards: wrecks burning on the surface, unexploded bombs drifting in the current, and oil slicks igniting under air attack. Yet the engineers kept the operation flowing. They turned disaster into adaptation. They built order from chaos. The sea itself became a tool of resistance. The same channel that had once isolated Britain now shielded its retreat, and by transforming the waters into a functioning highway under fire, these unseen builders ensured that Dunkirk did not end in annihilation, but endurance. The men, the tactics, and the engineering all formed one living machine, either fragile, imperfect, but alive. But there was still another battle to come, one that no soldier could control. A storm was gathering on the horizon, and with it came the test that would decide whether Dunkirk would be remembered as a miracle or a tragedy. As the night of May 26th descended, the scale of the disaster became clearer. The British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, had fought valiantly across Belgium and northern France. But the German Blitzkrieg had moved with terrifying precision. Their panzer divisions, led by commanders like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, had cut through the Ardennes forest, terrain Allied planners believed to be impassable. Now, the BEF, the French First Army, and remnants of the Belgian forces were trapped, encircled by German troops, their backs to the cold waters of the English Channel. The only hope left was evacuation, but there was a problem. Dunkirk's beaches, though wide and open, had shallow waters. The Royal Navy's large destroyers couldn't come close enough to shore. Soldiers would have to wade hundreds of meters through waist-deep water, under the scream of Stuka dive bombers, to reach the boats waiting offshore. And yet, something else was missing, something few realized until it was too late. The trains. In northern France, railways were the arteries of movement. They carried supplies, ammunition, and, in desperate times, men. When the evacuation order came, the plan was simple. Trains would bring tens of thousands of Allied troops to Dunkirk from surrounding areas like Lille, Arras, and Valenciennes. From there, ships would carry them across the Channel to England. But the train that never came became one of the most haunting phrases whispered among stranded soldiers. The German bombers had already destroyed many of the key rail junctions in northern France. Tracks were twisted and burned. Bridges collapsed. Entire convoys of locomotives lay derailed, their iron wheels half buried in mud and ash. Railway workers fled or were killed in the chaos. Communication lines were cut. By the time British commanders realized the scale of the damage, it was already too late. The BEF was ordered to move on foot, through miles of open countryside, through villages already abandoned or burning. Columns of men stretched for miles, hungry, exhausted, and terrified. Some pushed broken trucks. Others carried the wounded on makeshift stretchers. Every few hours, Luftwaffe aircraft circled overhead, strafing the roads with machine gun fire. The sound of Stukas, their dive sirens screaming, became the sound of despair itself. One soldier, Private William Hodge of the 2nd Royal Norfolk Regiment, later wrote in his diary, "We kept asking where the trains were. The officers said they'd come soon, but none ever did. We walked until our boots bled, and still Dunkirk was nowhere in sight." Behind them, French rearguard units fought desperately to slow the German advance. In towns like Cassel and Bergeau, small garrisons held out against tanks and artillery for as long as humanly possible. They knew their sacrifice meant one more day, one more train that might make it through. But those trains never came. The French rail network had become a graveyard of steel, and so the men marched on into history. When they finally reached Dunkirk, what they saw defied imagination. The beaches were lined with soldiers, hundreds of thousands, waiting in silence. Columns stretched as far as the eye could see, reaching out to the horizon. Smoke rose from the port city, black and heavy, marking the sky like a scar. Ships burned offshore. Ammunition depots exploded. And yet, amidst all the destruction, hope still flickered. Small boats, civilian vessels, fishing trawlers, even pleasure yachts, had begun crossing the channel from England. They were coming to help, but before the evacuation could truly begin, the rail crisis created one more tragedy. Thousands of troops still stranded inland, and men who never made it to the beach would be captured. When German armor closed the final ring around Dunkirk, the absence of trains had sealed their fate. It was not merely a logistical failure. It was a collapse of planning, communication, and timing under the immense pressure of Blitzkrieg warfare. As the first evacuation boats began loading men from the beaches, British command realized something chilling. Had even one train convoy made it through the northern lines, tens of thousands more could have been saved. Instead, those trains, and the soldiers who waited for them, became ghosts of Dunkirk. And from that point onward, the battle for survival had only one direction left, toward the sea. To understand the train that never came, one must look beyond the steel tracks and smoke. This was not just a logistical failure, it was a human story. A story of endurance, miscalculation, and the haunting weight of silence between orders that never arrived. For the soldiers stranded inland, the promise of the trains was like a lifeline whispered through chaos. Rumors spread that locomotives were on their way from Calais and Arras, that they would come under cover of night to carry battalions to Dunkirk. Men waited near the tracks, clutching rifles, staring into the distance. But the night remained empty. Only the faint glow of burning villages flickered on the horizon. The sound of trains was replaced by something else, the distant rumble of German artillery. Private Edward Cook of the 5th Royal Warwickshire Regiment recalled, "We waited near a broken station. The timetable still hung on the wall, May 1940. The last entry read Dunkirk Express, but no train ever came. Just silence and the smell of smoke." For many, the moment the realization hit that no help was coming was when the war became personal. They were no longer part of a massive army. They were small groups of men walking toward survival on foot, hunted from the skies. They tore strips from uniforms to bandage wounds, shared canteens half full of muddy water. Some carried letters they'd never post. And through it all, the tracks remained, cold and lifeless, running endlessly toward a sea that seemed impossibly far. The failure of the trains was rooted in chaos at the command level. The BEF and French command structures had begun to fracture under pressure. Radio lines were overloaded, field telephones destroyed, and orders delayed by hours, sometimes days. British Commander Lord Gort was faced with impossible decisions. Every message arriving at headquarters brought worse news. Another bridge lost, another town overrun. In theory, the evacuation plan, Operation Dynamo, relied heavily on coordinated movement toward the coast. But without rail support, the entire logistical network collapsed. By May 25th, over 60% of northern French rail routes were either bombed or under German control. The Luftwaffe's precision strikes had targeted junctions deliberately, turning the evacuation arteries into dead ends. In one instance, a train carrying wounded soldiers from Lille was hit near Hazebrouck. The entire convoy burned for 2 days. The smoke was visible from miles away, a grim warning to those still waiting. No one could confirm which routes were open. No one could guarantee that any train could reach Dunkirk alive. The tragedy wasn't in the lack of effort, but in the absence of coordination. Each unit acted on fragments of information, often outdated by the time it arrived. And so soldiers began, marching not because they were ordered to, but because they no longer trusted orders at all. There was a dark irony in how one of the most advanced logistics systems in Europe was undone by a new kind of war. In World War I, trains had defined movement. Entire armies depended on them. But by 1940, the German Blitzkrieg made those same rail lines obsolete in days. Tanks, armored vehicles, and aircraft had replaced trains as the primary engines of war. Speed, flexibility, and mobility, not schedules and tracks, determined survival. The Allies had not yet adapted to this reality. Their faith in the railway system reflected an older mindset, one built for static warfare, not for lightning advances. German Panzer divisions bypassed strongholds and rail hubs entirely, encircling them instead. The once powerful French railway grid became a series of traps, steel corridors where troops were cornered and annihilated. Historians later described it as a war that outpaced its infrastructure. The trains, once symbols of progress, became relics of a slower age, left behind by the engines of Blitzkrieg. Amidst the military chaos, one group fought a quieter, invisible battle, the French railway workers. Many stayed behind, risking their lives to keep the lines open for as long as possible. At the rail yard in Hazebrouck, engineers worked through the night, repairing tracks under shell fire. Some succeeded in sending a handful of supply trains toward Dunkirk, but most were intercepted or destroyed. Witnesses later spoke of workers who refused to leave their posts, guiding trains manually when signals failed, until the Luftwaffe bombed the station. A few even joined resistance efforts, smuggling British soldiers onto freight cars bound for the coast. Their names remain largely forgotten, buried in the dust of French records, but their bravery ensured that some men, at least, made it out alive. They were the last to leave. And in their silence lay a truth. This was not just a British evacuation, it was a shared tragedy of nations. As the final trains burned and the soldiers continued on foot, Dunkirk transformed from a point on the map into a pilgrimage, every step carrying the weight of failure. Courage and faith in the impossible. Each man walking toward the coast was, in his own way, chasing the train that never came. When the train stopped, leadership faltered, but leadership was also reborn in the chaos that followed. The train that never came wasn't just an evacuation failure. It became a test of character. And in that test, men discovered what war truly meant, not in victories, but in how they endured when every plan had already failed. In late May 1940, British and French command faced an agonizing truth. They were fighting a war they no longer controlled. At Dunkirk, leadership wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about survival. Lord Gort's decision to retreat was both condemned and celebrated. He had defied Churchill's earlier instruction to hold the line, choosing instead to save his men. It was a gamble, and in that gamble lay the seed of the evacuation's success. But down the chain of command, confusion reigned. Colonels and captains received orders that contradicted each other. Some were told to hold railway positions that no longer existed. Others were promised transport that would never arrive. Major General Harold Alexander described the moment with brutal clarity. We were giving orders to ghosts, to units that had already been wiped out or cut off. And yet, within this chaos, small acts of leadership emerged. Young officers took charge of scattered groups, leading them through woods, canals, and burning towns toward the coast. They had no maps, no transport, and often no hope. But they had one mission: reach Dunkirk. These were not the generals of history books. They were ordinary leaders who improvised, who refused to give in to despair. And they became the reason so many lived to tell the tale. From the German perspective, the failure of the Allied trains was not immediately recognized. Hitler's armored divisions, having crushed France's northern flank, paused near Dunkirk, a decision that baffled his own generals. For 2 days, the Panzers stood still. Hitler, fearing a counterattack from the south and persuaded by Hermann Göring that the Luftwaffe could finish the job, ordered the halt. This pause, this single hesitation, gave the Allies the time they needed to organize Operation Dynamo. German intelligence believed the British were trapped beyond rescue. They assumed that the damaged railways and blocked roads had sealed Dunkirk's fate, but the very breakdown that seemed fatal, the missing trains, the shattered supply routes, forced the Allies to innovate. They turned beaches into piers, civilian boats into lifelines, and a military collapse into one of history's most extraordinary escapes. The Germans had underestimated two things: human will and the unpredictable nature of desperation. For the soldiers left behind, the evacuation wasn't just a military ordeal, it was a moral reckoning. Many felt they had failed France, abandoned comrades, and fled rather than fought. When they finally reached English soil, soldiers described an eerie silence. No victory cheers, no celebrations, only relief and guilt intertwined. One private recalled, "We didn't speak on the ship home. We couldn't. The sound of the engines was the only thing keeping our thoughts quiet." The moral complexity of Dunkirk lay in its paradox. It was both defeat and deliverance. The missing trains symbolized the larger truth, that even the best prepared nations can collapse under the speed of change. But within that collapse, something profoundly human survived: compassion. French villagers hiding soldiers in barns, British officers refusing to abandon wounded men, civilians across the channel risking their lives to bring their sons home. The failure of the trains had exposed something machines could never capture: the endurance of conscience. Before Dunkirk, the British psyche was fractured. The fall of France had seemed inevitable. Defeat hung in the air like smoke. But as the evacuation succeeded, and despite every failure, it created something new: belief. A strange sense of pride began to grow, not in victory but in survival itself. This was the Dunkirk spirit, and not born from strategy, but from the refusal to surrender when the world was collapsing. Churchill would later say, "Wars are not won by evacuations." And yet, what happened at Dunkirk redefined the moral framework of the Allied fight. The loss became a symbol, a warning that even in retreat there can be courage. The missing trains no longer stood for failure. They became part of the legend, a reminder that history's turning points are rarely clean or triumphant. They are forged in confusion, sacrifice, and endurance. By the end of May, the tracks across northern France were empty, twisted rails running through fields of smoke. But in Britain, the story of Dunkirk had already begun to spread. And in that story, the train that never came had found a different kind of arrival, not on rails, but in hearts. Dunkirk, May 27 to 31, 40. The evacuation had begun, not with confidence but with desperation. The men who had waited for trains that never came now stood in endless lines along the sand, staring out to sea. Smoke from Calais drifted across the horizon. Every sound, the whine of distant engines, the crash of bomb, felt like a countdown. Operation Dynamo had just been activated under the command of Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay. His orders were simple but nearly impossible: evacuate as many men as possible. The Admiralty expected perhaps 45,000. There were over 338,000 waiting. At first there was no system, no order. Men wandered aimlessly through dunes and wreckage, searching for boats that weren't there. The tide ran red with fuel and oil. Abandoned vehicles half buried in sand became makeshift cover as Luftwaffe fighters swooped low, their machine guns spraying panic into the crowds. Bombs fell not only on the beaches, but on the town itself. Dunkirk, once a quiet port city, was now a burning labyrinth of shattered windows, flames licking through churches and schools. The harbor was destroyed. The main piers had been hit repeatedly, rail lines twisted and melted, the final proof that the trains were never coming. Yet amid that ruin, something extraordinary began to happen. Small groups of soldiers, engineers, and sailors started to improvise. Wooden planks, trucks, and broken jetties were lashed together to form makeshift moles, temporary docks that reached into the sea. Men waded waist-deep into the freezing surf to load the wounded onto any boat that could float. There was no plan, only instinct. And instinct became their salvation. As chaos unfolded on the beaches across the English Channel, a call went out. Civilians, fishermen, yacht owners, tugboat captains, were asked to help. Within 48 hours, hundreds of small vessels began to cross the channel. They were slow, fragile, and mostly unarmed. But together they became the heart of the miracle. From Ramsgate to Dover, boats launched into rough waters guided by little more than courage and a compass. Some never returned. Others made trip after trip, their decks crammed with soldiers, silent, soaked, exhausted. On one small boat, a British fisherman reportedly whispered to his son, "We're not rescuing heroes. We're rescuing the war itself." That was the truth. Every man pulled from that beach was a fragment of Britain's future. The German offensive had tightened around Dunkirk. By May 30th, artillery was within range. Shells landed on the sands, sending plumes of earth skyward. Columns of smoke rose miles high, blending into storm clouds that rolled over the channel. The weather turned violent. Winds whipped across the coast, waves crashing against the fragile docks. Visibility dropped. Ships collided, overturned, burned, and yet, even as the elements turned against them, the evacuation continued. British destroyers like HMS Keith and HMS Basilisk fought to the last, pulling hundreds aboard before being struck by bombs. Sailors dove into the sea to drag men from wreckage, often under strafing fire. There was no time for rest. Every minute mattered. The beaches echoed with the sounds of survival. Men shouting for space on boats, medics calling out for stretchers, engines sputtering as they fought the rising tide. And above it all, the haunting cry of the Luftwaffe sirens, a reminder that the enemy was never far. In a grim twist of irony, the same soldiers who had once waited for trains now boarded boats with the same hollow hope. The steel rails of northern France had led them nowhere. But the open sea, uncertain, deadly had become their only path home. And for the first time they were moving. Men who had marched through defeat now felt motion again, a feeling that meant life. Yet for every man saved, dozens still waited. Every night the lines on the beach grew shorter, and the odds grew worse. The Germans had closed the circle around Dunkirk. The clock was ticking, and everyone knew it. On May 31st, as night fell, a strange calm swept the beach. Searchlights flickered across the waves, illuminating broken ships drifting in the dark. The wind had died. For a few hours, the bombers stayed away. Men huddled together on the sand, sharing what little food or cigarettes they had left. Some prayed. Others simply stared at the black horizon. A young private wrote in his journal that night, "It feels like the world has stopped breathing. We're all just waiting and for a sound, for a signal, for something that means we still exist." And that signal would come, not from the sky, not from command, but from the sea, because at dawn, a new fleet was approaching, larger, faster, more determined. The final phase of the evacuation was about to begin, and with it came the storm that would decide everything. The tide was turning, but so was the weather. The next morning, nature itself would test whether this desperate miracle could survive. June 1st, 1940, the dawn broke with an eerie stillness, the kind that feels like the pause before a storm. Out in the channel, the sea looked calm, but dark clouds gathered on the horizon. British destroyers were already in motion, cutting through the mist. Behind them, dozens of civilian boats followed, fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, ferry boats, even a handful of lifeboats. Each one carried a flag. Each one carried hope. The evacuation entered its final phase. And then the sky opened. By mid-morning, the wind began to howl. Rain lashed across the coast, turning sand into mud and seawater into chaos. Visibility collapsed. The horizon disappeared. The coastline blurred into smoke. What should have been the end of the operation turned into a fight against both enemy and nature. Luftwaffe bombers, frustrated by the weather, tried to strike through cloud gaps. Explosions flashed like lightning, but there was something almost supernatural about what followed. The same storm that tore at the Allied fleet also protected it. The clouds grounded German aircraft for hours. Waves were brutal, but the skies, for the first time in days, were theirs alone. Fate, it seemed, had chosen sides. At Dover Castle, deep beneath the cliffs, Vice Admiral Ramsay studied reports coming in from Dunkirk. His staff officers urged him to halt the operation. Ships were lost. The weather was worsening. The enemy was closing. Ramsay listened and then gave his answer. "We continue." The order spread across the channel. no retreat, no pause. Every ship still capable of movement turned back toward Dunkirk. Fishermen who had already made 2 or 3 crossings refueled and set sail again. Despite exhaustion, some didn't even wait for orders. They simply couldn't leave their comrades behind. As darkness fell again, Dunkirk became a haunting sight. The shoreline was littered with the black silhouettes of wrecked ships. Flames flickered in the distance, a burning oil depot, a ruined pier, the remains of a downed aircraft. Men moved silently now. The chaos of earlier days was gone. They formed quiet lines, boots crunching softly in the wet sand, eyes fixed on the faint glow of ship lights offshore. The last trains had never come, but now, boat by boat, the army of a nation was being carried home. Each man who stepped aboard left behind a piece of himself, a helmet, a rifle, a promise to return. And for those still waiting, there was no despair anymore, only endurance. They had seen the impossible begin to happen. From June 1st to June 4th, the evacuation reached its climax. Every available vessel was thrown into the fight. Destroyers, minesweepers, tugboats, anything that could float was pressed into service. At one point, the channel became so crowded that ships had to navigate through wreckage to reach shore. Sailors and soldiers worked shoulder to shoulder, waist deep in water, forming human chains to move the wounded and load supplies. At 3 a.m. on June 4th, the final evacuation orders were issued. By then, over 338,000 men had been rescued, including more than 120,000 French troops. Hitler's forces were only miles away, but when they finally reached the beaches, there was nothing left to destroy. Only burned equipment, empty helmets, and the echo of engines vanishing across the sea. Dunkirk had fallen. But the soldiers had escaped, and in that escape was the seed of everything that would follow. Britain's survival, America's eventual entry, the liberation of Europe itself. What had begun as a disaster ended as a symbol. Even the German High Command, reading reports of the evacuation, struggled to understand it. How could an entire army vanish beneath their grasp? For them, Dunkirk was not a defeat. It was confusion. A pause before the storm they thought would end the war. But they were wrong. Because the miracle of Dunkirk was more than just survival. It was a message to the world that even in retreat, courage could win time. And sometimes time was all that mattered. When the final ships returned to Britain, they carried men too tired to speak. They didn't cheer. They didn't raise their arms. They simply looked back, at the sea, at the smoke, at the place where history had almost ended. On the docks of Dover, nurses handed out tea. Locals wrapped soldiers in blankets. Some wept, some laughed weakly. Most just stood in silence, unsure whether to call it victory or defeat. Winston Churchill would later remind the nation, "Wars are not won by evacuations." But everyone knew, without Dunkirk, there would have been no war left to fight. The last man stepped ashore. The last boat docked. And as dawn broke over Dover, the miracle was complete. The trains had never come for them in France, but the sea itself had carried them home. When the guns finally fell silent, the beaches of Dunkirk became a graveyard of steel. Tanks half submerged in water, rifles scattered like bones, and the faint smell of oil and smoke hung heavy in the air. The evacuation, codenamed Operation Dynamo, had saved 338,226 Allied soldiers, but it had cost them nearly everything else. Over 200 ships lay at the bottom of the channel, destroyers, minesweepers, and merchant vessels. The Royal Air Force had lost 145 aircraft in the skies above Dunkirk. On land, the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, left behind over 2,400 artillery pieces, 65,000 vehicles, and nearly 500,000 tons of supplies. It was the largest military abandonment in British history. For those who made it home, the victory was bittersweet. Many soldiers disembarked in Dover barefoot, their faces covered in soot and salt, their minds still echoing with the thunder of Stuka dive bombers. Some were greeted with cheers. Others collapsed on the docks in silence. They had escaped, but they had also lost France, lost comrades, lost faith in the invincibility of their empire. In Berlin, the mood was triumphant. Adolf Hitler stood before his generals and called it a miracle of German arms. He had trapped the British at the sea's edge, and yet the miracle was not his. It was Britain's. Because while Germany saw Dunkirk as a tactical victory, Churchill saw it as a moral resurrection. On June 4, 1940, Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons and gave one of the most defiant speeches in modern history. He did not pretend it was a triumph. He called it what it was, a colossal military disaster. But then he turned that disaster into defiance, declaring, "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender." Those words transformed a retreat into resilience. Dunkirk became not the end of Britain's war, but the beginning of its endurance. Behind the headlines, however, the human toll lingered. Thousands of French soldiers were left behind to hold the line while British boats departed. Many were captured, some executed by German troops. The French rearguards at Lille, led by General Molinier, fought for 5 days against impossible odds, buying precious hours for the evacuation. Few of them ever saw home again. The civilians who had answered the call, the fishermen, ferrymen, and yacht owners, returned to quiet lives. But they were changed men. Their small wooden boats, once symbols of leisure, had carried the weight of war. Some were sunk. Some still lie beneath the English Channel, preserved by salt and time. For the British military, Dunkirk was both a lesson and a warning. They realized that modern war was not just about bravery. It was about logistics, speed, and air supremacy. The loss of so much heavy equipment would cripple their capabilities for months, but it also forced innovation. Factories in Britain began working around the clock, producing new tanks, rifles, and Spitfires to rebuild the army that had nearly vanished on those French beaches. Germany, meanwhile, turned its eyes to the skies. Hitler's generals, confident after Dunkirk, believed that the British would soon sue for peace. They prepared for an air offensive that would break Britain's spirit once and for all, Operation Sea Lion. They were wrong. The men who had survived Dunkirk would soon take to the skies and the cliffs to defend their homeland. As Churchill later said, "Wars are not won by evacuations." But Dunkirk was not about victory. It was about survival. It was proof that even in the face of overwhelming defeat, a nation could still stand, still fight, still refuse to die quietly. And so, as the tide washed over the wrecks of Dunkirk, it carried away more than oil and debris. It carried away the illusion of invincibility and left behind the raw, defiant soul of a people who would not surrender. In the end, Dunkirk was not a story of victory. It was a story of will. The beaches of northern France did not witness conquest. They witnessed endurance. Every soldier who stood in the surf, waiting for a boat that might never come, carried within him the quiet defiance of a nation refusing to collapse. The train that never came, the failed evacuation routes by rail, became a symbol of everything that went wrong. But it was also the reason the miracle happened. Because when the rails failed, the seas answered. When machines broke, men rowed. And when the British Empire stood at the edge of its ruin, the smallest boats in its history became its salvation. Dunkirk changed the rhythm of the war. It reminded the world that courage was not measured in victories, but in how long you could stand when everything else fell apart. It taught generals that wars are not fought by numbers alone. They are fought by hearts that refuse to yield. The men rescued from Dunkirk would fight again, in North Africa, in Italy, in Normandy. And when they returned to the beaches of France 4 years later, they did not come as fugitives, but as liberators. Their return was not just military justice. It was history completing its circle. Today, the sands of Dunkirk are quiet. The wrecks rest beneath shallow waves, their outlines visible only at low tide. Tourists walk where soldiers once prayed for deliverance. The wind carries no sound of bombers, only the distant whisper of the Channel. The same waters that once carried 338,000 souls to freedom. Dunkirk was not the end of the British Empire, nor the beginning of its glory. It was the moment in between, when hope was fragile, when courage was all that remained, and when an entire nation chose to believe that survival itself could be an act of victory. And that is why, even now, history remembers not the fall, but the rescue. The day when the world watched Britain retreat, yet refused to break.